Welcome everybody to Confessions of a True Crime Addict. Make some noise! Alright, now please go bananas for your host, James Renner!
Hello, Portland. How are you? I smell popcorn. I didn't even know there was popcorn. It smells so wonderful out here. Does anybody, you've got a big bowl of popcorn right there. That's wonderful. I might have to borrow some of that a little bit. I love Portland. I've only been here a couple times though. And every time I'm here, I'm struck by how weird this place is, which is why I like it, but I was never able to put my finger on why I thought this place was weird until today, until I flew in from San Diego today, and I'm driving around and it hit me. I'm like, oh my God, yes. The reason Portland is so weird to me is because of the zoning. Like you guys, zoning to you is kind of like a guideline, isn't it? It's not really like a law. I'm driving down Martin Luther King and I passed this place with like 100 lawnmowers stacked on top of each other. And then there's a donut shop. And then there's like some dude's house. And a Popeyes, a CVS. And then there's this shack that they turned into like retail. And they're like, fuck it. We're gonna sell pizza, traveler's insurance, and flannel shirts. So anyways, I very much like Portland. I like coming here. I like your lackadaisical laws on weed, for instance. It's still illegal in Ohio, by the way. We've got medical, but it's not there yet. Anyways, I'm James Renner. I'm a true crime addict. I'm a true crime enthusiast. I was a reporter in Cleveland for about 10 years. We had 2 serial killers, while I was a reporter, you might have heard of them, Anthony Sowell and Ariel Castro. I am recently back from CrimeCon. Has anybody been to CrimeCon? But CrimeCon, for those that don't know, is this annual convention for true crime enthusiasts, people that like watching Dateline NBC and Snapped and Making a Murderer and things like that. You can go and be among your people. But that's the thing about CrimeCon is you'll run into these quasi-celebrities that are only famous because of their association with crime, either covering it or being a part of it or a witness to it. Which leads me to what happened day 2 at the bar. And to understand this story, you have to know a little bit about my wife. Her name's Julie. 2 things you need to know about Julie. 1, she hates true crime with the white hot intensity of 1,000 suns. She wants nothing to do with true crime. And as a true crime reporter, you kind of need somebody like that to bring you down at the end of the day and, to keep you real. Number 2, she's kind of sexy as fuck. She really is. She's got these legs that go all the way up. I've checked. So knowing those 2 things, we're at the bar after the second day of CrimeCon, and I look over at the end of the bar is Ken Kratz. And if you don't know who Ken Kratz is, he's the prosecutor for Making a Murderer, and he's famous for coercing a false confession out of a teenage boy. Great guy. And I see Ken Kratz at the end of the bar, and I think, oh my God, this is my opportunity to start that Photos with Assholes photo album that I've always wanted to start. And I can start with him, and then I can get like Amber Geiger, or Casey Anthony, or Lars Larson, whoever. Thank you. I tried to put in a local joke. So I turn to Julie and I say, hey, I gotta get a picture with Ken Kratz. And so I take Julie over, we go over to the end of the bar, and Ken Kratz is there. And I say, Mr. Kratz, would you mind if my wife takes a picture with you and I? And he looks at me, and then he looks at Julie, and his eyes do this, all the way to her toes, and all the way up. And he has this high-pitched, creepy little man voice, and he says, how about I get a picture with her instead? To which she says, because I don't know who the fuck you are. And if you've never seen a grown man's pride crumble before you, put it on your bucket list, because it's amazing. The other reason I go to CrimeCon is to meet people that read my books and that are into these stories. And you have conversations with them that you don't have online. And the number one question that I'm asked when I meet people in person is, why do you do what you do? You know, why are you so strange? Why do you have a life devoted to true crime? And I always tell them the same story. And it's because of something that happened when I was 11 years old. And this is 1989, Ohio, and this is the year that little Amy Mihaljevic went missing. Amy and I were both born in 1978. She would be turning 41 this year. It's the 30th anniversary of this crime. And for those unfamiliar with Amy's case, on October 27th, 1989, this 10-year-old girl with a side saddle ponytail went to Bay Plaza after school to meet up with an adult male. And he had been calling her home after she got out of school, and there was a window of about an hour where she was home alone every day. And he'd call her up and say, hey, your mother just got a promotion at work. Why don't you meet me at this plaza on Friday? I'll take you to go get a gift. It'll be our little secret and make your mom very happy. This was the ruse he used with her. So on a Friday afternoon in broad daylight in Bay Village, Ohio, which is an affluent suburb of Cleveland. Yes, there are affluent suburbs of Cleveland. Across the street from the police station, this guy abducted Amy Mihaljevic and went off into the sunset. And she was missing. So I was 11 years old at the time. My mother lived in Rocky River, which is across the tracks from Bay Village. And I'd see her poster, her missing poster, on all the telephone poles. And I'd see that and I'd think, if she was in my 6th grade class back at home, she'd be the girl I'd be passing notes to. Do you like me? I like you. Yes, no, maybe. So it was that moment in my life where I realized we lived in a dangerous world. And I became obsessed with trying to solve this case when I was 11 years old for one reason or another. I'd get on my Huffy 2-speed bike and I'd ride it to Westgate Mall, because at the time, the mall was where everybody was at any given time. The most people were gathering at the mall. And I would sit by Aladdin's Castle, which is this arcade in the corner, and I'd watch the people come and go, and I'd look for men that looked like the composite sketch of Amy's killer. And if I saw somebody that looked similar enough, I'd follow him out to his car, get his license plate number, write it down, and then run back into the mall and use the payphone to call in the tip. A weird hobby for an 11-year-old. Unfortunately, the only phone number I knew by heart at that time was 876-5353, which is the toll-free number for unsolved mysteries. So somewhere Robert Stack has all these recordings of an 11-year-old James Renner sending in Amy Mihaljevic tips. So flash forward to February 1990, this is 3 months later, they find Amy's body in a wheat field in Ashland County, Ohio, which is about an hour from Bay Village, and it's in the middle of nowhere. Just this wheat field out in the country. Now my dad, I lived with my dad. My parents divorced when I was very young. My father got custody. I was a country kid during the week, a city kid on the weekends. I'd visit my mother. During the week I was in the country, and my dad was running this construction company, his own business, and he had just fired a guy who wasn't all there in the head. His name was Andy. And my father would come home after work, or would go out to his truck, and tucked under the windshield wipers would be these notes, and he'd pick them up from Andy. And it would say, "I'm coming after your kids," meaning me or my little sister. So when Amy Mihaljevic's body was found, my father had this in his mind. And he knew how obsessed I was with the case, and he came home early that day. I was home watching the news, and I remember him coming home and turning off the TV. And he looked at me and he said, "Jimmy," he said, "do you know what to do if you're ever abducted, like Amy Mihaljevic?" And I said, yeah, I've been watching the news for months, of course. I make a lot of noise, I kick the guy in the nuts, and then I run. He's like, well, yeah, but what if that doesn't work? What if he gets you back to his place and he's got you like handcuffed to a couch or something? I'm like, Jesus, Dad, I'm 11, I don't know. And he said, well, I've been thinking about this on the ride home, and I have an idea. He said, if what happened to Amy Mihaljevic happens to you, and you end up in this guy's house, chained to a couch or something, what I want you to do is pick up pieces of the carpet, little bits of the couch, tear off bits of the couch, little knickknacks, anything you can get your hands on, and swallow it. He said, that way, if what happened to Amy happens to you, we can do an autopsy. We'll find that evidence, and then I'll know who I should kill. So welcome to my comedy show. This is why true crime became my life. Amy Mihaljevic. Does anyone else go about their day with Keith Morrison's voice in the back of their head, narrating their daily life? Or Lester Holt, or anybody from Dateline NBC? I've watched so many of those shows that I can't get his voice out of my head, you know? And especially when I'm traveling, like I'll pull onto like I-80 and I'll hear that voice as I'm getting the ticket. It's like Renner's Subaru Forester was last seen pulling onto I-80. And the ticket was stamped 6:38 p.m. And that's the last anybody ever saw of him alive. Little did he know he was gonna take a detour into Murder Town. I think about this a lot when I'm working during the day. I do a lot of my writing during the day. My wife, Julie, is a teacher. I get the kids off to school and then I do my writing. As you can see, I work through lunch. And I like visiting new restaurants in Akron, Ohio, where I'm from. And some of these, the better restaurants are always in the worst neighborhoods. And every town has this intersection, this little area. In Akron, it's the intersection of Arlington and Exchange Street. And that's the intersection where you can go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can get some crack or some meth. You could get a $5 hand job if you wanted. They also have the new stuff that the kids are into, like fentanyl, like Mike and Ike's and Cagney and Lacey's, whatever they're doing. And but that's that intersection. It's kind of like Stanley, what is it? Sandy Boulevard? Is that right? Okay, Sandy Boulevard. So think of that. There's this Thai place over there. And every time I go to that Thai, it has excellent pho. And every time I go to that Thai place, and I have to park on Exchange and walk in, and I think, if I'm murdered or I disappear between parking my car and getting into that Thai place, nobody will assume I'm there for Thai food. And I see the headlines in the Beacon Journal the next day. You know, Renner's Subaru was found on Exchange Street. You know, what was he doing in that neighborhood? You know, does it have anything to do with the cache of porn the police found on his computer? All those young women in dirty white socks. That's right. That's what I'm into. But I'm not the good thing is I'm not a good target for abductions anymore. I'm not I've kind of aged out of abductions, so I've got that going for me, which is cool. I'm too heavy to fit into the trunk of any vehicle easily. But it wasn't always that way. And I want to tell you about something that happened when I was 13. This was just a couple years after Amy Mihaljevic disappeared. My mother had moved from Rocky River to this other suburb of Cleveland called Old Brooklyn. It's by the zoo, kind of a crummy little section of town. And she lived in these apartments, and across the street from the apartments was this park. Now remember, I live with my dad during the week in the country, and in the country I can ride my bike and go exploring in the woods and nobody bothers you. I thought the same thing was true for the city. So one day, I'm visiting my mother on the weekend, and I decide to explore this park across the street. And I walk over, and there's just like one car in the parking lot, and I see this path that leads into the woods by this nice little creek. And to get there, you have to pass the men's room. And as I'm walking over there, 13-year-old James Renner, I look over, and standing in the men's room door is this man, and he's grabbing himself. And I kind of like rationalize it away. I'm like, oh, he has an itch, okay. And I walk along the path, and I look back, and now the guy's walking along the path. And I get that first tinge of apprehension. And so I start jogging. And I look back, and now the guy's jogging after me. And so I start booking it as fast as I can down this path. But the path only goes further and further into the woods, away from civilization. And now this guy is running as fast as he can at me. And there's nowhere to go. Now, to the left of the path are these berry bushes, and on the other side of the berry bushes is a train track. And that train track leads back to civilization, back to the apartments. It's my only way out. So I go crashing through the berry bushes. I get on the train track. I start running. I can hear him behind me. I hear the gravel kicking up. And I realize he is faster than me. He's going to catch me before I make the road. My only chance at this point, because on both sides of the train track now are walls of shale. My only chance is to scale one of these walls to get away. Now I'm 13, I'm 120 pounds soaking wet. And I'm able to do it. I scale this wall, I get up to the top, I don't slip. And as soon as I'm up, I look down and he's right there. Right there. And to this day, I remember two things about this man's face. One, just this look of rage. I'd never seen rage on an adult's face like that before. And two, he looked exactly like Leonard Nimoy. So I've never really been able to enjoy the original Star Trek series. So I flicked him off. And I ran back to the apartment where my mother lived. We called the police. They arrived. By then, he's long gone. And the police kind of laugh it off. You know, remember, it's 1992, 91, Northeast Ohio. And what they say is, kid, you can't explore these woods. This is where the queers hang out. As if that had anything to do with it. So these things happen. And I wonder if they happen in everybody's life to an extent. I fell in love with journalism. I got involved with journalism at Kent State University when I was a student in the late 90s. And I wasn't a journalism student, I was an English student. I thought maybe I would teach English, eventually, and thank God I decided against that for everybody's sakes. But I started writing for the student newspaper, the Kent Stater. And I think everybody has, no matter where you went to college, there was always this tow truck company that took advantage of the students, that preyed on the students. At least it's that way in Ohio. And at Kent State, we had this place called City Towing. And here's what they would do. You know, me and my friends, we lived in these places called townhomes, this townhome apartment complex. And City Towing would set up their tow trucks around the corner. And they would send in their wives for reconnaissance late at night with little walkie-talkies. And they would come in and literally hide in the bushes and wait for your friend to come up, park their car, and walk inside. And then they'd radio back. And I want you to picture like extras from Deliverance. This is what we're talking about. And they'd be like, okay, we got one. And then the tow truck would swoop in and grab your friend's car and take it off to impound. And it was $150 to get your car out, which is a lot of money if you're going to Kent State. So I wrote a series of articles making fun of this towing place and how they were nothing but a bunch of hillbillies. And they did not like this. And so they took my picture from the paper and they blew it up into a wanted poster. And it said, "Wanted, James Renner. Reward for the first person that tows his car." And my friends would get their cars towed and they would see this wanted poster in the lobby of this towing place and they'd come back and they're like, "Dude, this place has it out for you. You better be careful." And I'd be like, "I'm not that stupid. You know, I'm never gonna get my car towed, it's fine. Flash forward to the week of graduation. I graduated in December 2000 in Ohio. That's gonna be important here in a minute. So I had this Mickey Mouse final at Michael Swartz, and it was for something like Intro to Astronomy, where I knew the whole final would take like 10 minutes. So I decided, I bet I could park in the visitor's lot of this apartment complex across the street, walk in, do my final, it'd be fine. Of course, I take the final, I come out, my car is gone. And I know right away that who towed it, you know, and I'm pissed. They won, right? So I take a bus, I get as close to City Towing as I can, I walk the rest of the way, I come around the corner, there's City Towing, they've got their impound lot, the wrought iron fence, and the fence is wide open, the door's wide open, and there, right inside, is my 1994 Sunfire. And I think, I've got the keys in my pocket. I bet I can take my car back before anybody can stop me. And they won't report it to the police because they're so shady. This is what goes through the mind of a 21-year-old man. So I run to the Sunfire, I jump inside, and I get my keys, and I turn the ignition, and just like out of a horror movie, it doesn't catch. And of course they're watching. 3 men come out of nowhere. There's suddenly a guy on the right, and he's got this Slim Jim, and he's trying to open the car door, and there's a guy on the left pounding on the window, and then the leader comes out. I'm assuming he's the leader because he has this wrench in his hand that's like comically too large to serve any other purpose than like busting skulls. And he stands in front of the car and he starts yelling at me. He's like, "Get out of the fucking car, I'm gonna fuck you up." And to which I said, no, that sounds terrible. I think I'm gonna stay in here. And so I'm locking the doors and trying to get this guy out. And finally the car starts and I start nudging it forward. And the guy with the wrench climbs onto the hood of my car, grabs the windshield wipers, looks at me and says, "Now what are you gonna do?" So I floored it. Now there's some discrepancy about how long this man was on the hood of my car. I say 40 feet. The official police report says 400 feet. So it's probably somewhere in the middle, you know, dealer's choice. But eventually I slow down and he jumps off and tries to punch through the window. Doesn't work. I get away. And I'm celebrating. I'm like, I did it. I got away. I got my car back. I get as far as the university, and I see lights in the rearview mirror. I find out later the police officer who pulled me over was actually the chief of police. His name was James Peach, which I've always enjoyed. And he pulls me over, and he gets out of his cruiser, and he walks over, knocks on the window, and I roll it down, playing it cool. And he says, "Where were you just now?" And I say, "Well, I was taking a final. I'm graduating this week. And now I'm on my way to the Center of Hope. I was going to help the nuns sort the clothes." And he says, "Is that the story you want to go with?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me." And he says, "Step out of the car, sir." So I step out of the car. Remember, I graduated December in Ohio. There's snow everywhere. A nice blanket of snow covering everything, covering the ground, covering my car. And he walks me in front, and you know, there's snow everywhere, except for the imprint of a man on the hood of my car. And I just hang my head, and I say, "I did something really stupid." And he says, "Yes, you did." Turn around, and he cuffs me, takes me to jail, charges me with attempted vehicular assault, which is a felony that carries a prison term of 8 years. 8 years in prison. And this was what I was facing the week of graduation. I didn't end up staying in jail that night, thank God. I was bailed out by my future father-in-law, which made for awkward conversation on the way home. And they eventually, since I'd never been in trouble before, they made me a deal. They're like, if you plead to, we'll knock that down to an F5, which is what we call a baby felony. And if you plead to the F5, you'll have it on your record for 3 years, and if you stay out of trouble, we'll wipe it away. It'll be like it never happened. And so I took the deal. And I had some probation that I had to do. But the other thing was, I graduated and I had this baby felony on my record for 3 years. And this is at a time where I'm filling out applications every day. And it is illegal when you get that application and you get that question that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? It's illegal to check no if in fact you have. However, it is not illegal to leave it blank. And 9 times out of 10, they don't check. Especially if what you're applying for is a position as a server at a place called Rock Bottom in the flats of Cleveland, which is where I worked for the next 3 years. After those 3 years, it was wiped off, and I applied for a job as a writer at a place called Cleveland Scene Magazine, which is like our Village Voice newspaper. I'm not sure what they have in Portland, but I'm sure you have a weekly paper here, right? What's it called?
Mercury.
The Mercury? Okay.
Willamette Weekly.
Yeah, Willamette Weekly, yes. So it's kind of like that, and it was a fun job. I started in the mailroom in 2003, and if you're too young to remember what was going on in 2003, let me fill you in. There's this crazy guy who was mailing anthrax to reporters. I worked in the mailroom. They hired me to open every single piece of mail that came in through there, because apparently I was expendable. But they let me pitch stories, and of course the first story I pitched was the Amy Mihaljevic case. And by then, it had been 16 years. And I thought, as a naive young reporter, of course the police have to know who did this by now. They just don't have enough evidence to convict him. So what I'll do is I'll talk to the police, I'll talk to the family, the witnesses, I'll find out who their lead suspect is, and I'll share it with everybody. And then we'll solve the case. I quickly learned that the reason that they'd never solved the Amy Mihaljevic case was because there were too many men that had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime. The best the FBI had ever been able to do was narrow it down to a top 25 list. And I don't know if it's something about Amy Mihaljevic or if it's like this for every case. I don't know what would be the better answer, but I remember speaking with the FBI spokesman at the time, this guy named Agent Bob Hawk, which is the coolest name for an FBI agent. And I sat down with him and we talked about the case, and he said, let me tell you how crazy the Amy Mihaljevic case is. He said, there's something I've been thinking about as a possibility. He said, I think it's possible this man who was calling her at home and set up the abduction might not be the guy that took her. That some guy had planned this abduction and lured Amy to this plaza, and then some other rando saw the opportunity and whisked her away. How crazy would that be? I don't know. Eventually I learned about the top suspect in Amy's case. And this is after I had actually written a book about the Amy Mihaljevic case. Found out about this guy in 2008 from a former FBI agent. This is their top suspect for many years. He was this teacher in Amherst, Ohio. And he was Teacher of the Year for, I don't know, back in the 90s. And he taught middle school science. And in his classroom, he had kind of like a little zoo. He had like fish and tropical fish and guinea pigs and hamsters and lizards. And there were all these little animals in his classroom. And he also bred mice in his classroom. And it would when he bred too many of these mice, he would take the extras and he would take them into Bay Village to this place called the Nature Center, where they also had some animals. And he would feed the extra mice to the snakes, which is kind of creepy, right? Now, Amy's case comes down to this Nature Center. The Nature Center is very important because that's where the police believe that Amy's killer was able to get her phone number. Amy, in the weeks before her abduction, visited the nature center. They had a logbook where the kids would come in and sign their name, address, and phone number to get on the mailing list back then. And they think that's where the killer found her. So nature center is very important. And he was connected to it. Now the FBI didn't start looking into this guy until 2005. And something happened in the state of Ohio in 2005 where for the first time, if you were a teacher and you had been teaching for decades, you had to submit fingerprints. This guy started teaching in the early 70s. Nobody was taking fingerprints. He was 29 years into a 30-year teaching career. And the administration, the principal came up to him and said, hey, sorry about this, but we need your prints. They changed the laws. Everybody's got to be reprinted. And he said no. And he refused to give his prints, and he quit instead of giving them his prints. And he disappeared. He quit and he disappeared. Nobody knew where he was for 6 months. And then he pops up in a homeless shelter in Key West, Florida, which is as far from Bay Village as you can get without leaving the United States. So they were really interested in this guy for a while. They found out that at the time of Amy's disappearance, he lived a half mile from where her body was found in Ashland County. He looked exactly like the composite sketch of the guy seen leading her away in the plaza. And then they went to the witness in the case. These two classmates of Amy's saw her with this man in the plaza. And they gave this witness, the girl, a lineup. And it's not like you see in movies like The Usual Suspects where they bring out 6 people and you have to pick which one it was. In real life, they give you a sheet of paper and there are 30 faces on this lineup. And this witness went right to this teacher's picture, his name is Dean, and said, this is the guy that I saw with Amy. So, they were really interested in this guy. They went down and interrogated him, gave him a lie detector test, and the police told me, they're like, we asked him if he was at that nature center, and he says he wasn't. I'm like, well, is that all it takes? You just say no? That sounds terrible. So I realized when I learned about this guy, I had to find him. I had to go down to Key West. I knew he was somewhere on Key West, and Key West was an island off the coast of Florida, of course. And I knew islands from Lake Erie. We have islands on Lake Erie. I'm like, how big could Key West be? I'm sure I can find him. If you've never been to Key West, it's a big fucking island. I flew into Miami. I gave myself 36 hours to find him before I had to get a flight back to Ohio. So I fly into Miami, I get a car, I drive into Key West. I've got this guy's picture, and I literally go up and down that main strip where like Ernest Hemingway's house is. And I start showing shop owners this guy's picture. And I'm like, have you seen this man? And a couple of them were like, oh yeah, that's that weird guy that plays ragtime piano at the bar in the corner. And I knew that was him because in the summers when he wasn't teaching, Dean played ragtime piano at Disney World. So it was like a game of Carmen Sandiego. I was always like 2 steps behind wherever he was on that island, and I could never quite catch up with him. And it came down to 45 minutes before I had to start driving back to Miami if I wanted to catch my flight, and I still hadn't found this man. I find myself on the northeast quadrant of the island, and I pull up to a stop sign. And I'm a lapsed Catholic. I went to a lot of Sunday school when I was a kid. But I hadn't prayed in years. And you could call it a prayer, you could call it a message to the universe, you could call it a message to Amy. But I sent out this message and I said, if this is the guy that did it, I need help because I can't find him. And at that moment, he walked in front of my car. I can't explain it. That's what happened. I pulled through the stop sign, I parked, I got out of my car, I yell out, hey Dean. He stops on a corner, and I walk over to him, and I say the ballsiest thing I've ever said as a reporter. I said, hey, do you know who I am? And he says, yes, you're James Renner. My sister said you'd be looking for me. And I decided to bluff him because it all comes down to whether or not he was at that nature center. The police told me he said he wasn't there. Now, I talked to a former student of his that said, yes, of course he was there. He would feed the mice to the snakes. So it all comes down to the nature center. And I said, Dean, what would you tell me if I told you I had in my pocket a picture of you and one of your students at that nature center? And he thought for a second, and that's exactly what he said. He said, I never told the FBI I wasn't there. I only ever said, I don't remember being there. So I said, what else don't you remember? And he said, we're done talking. And he walked away. And he's still down there to this day, unarrested. And that is, to date, still the best suspect in the case. Now for the Amy case, you know, I did everything I could to find more clues in that case. And other than Dean, there were some really good suspects that came and went. And I know on TV and in the media, you hear about these reporters that go digging through people's garbage to find clues. That never happens in real life. We don't do that, except for this once. There was this other suspect for Amy's murder who looked really good for a little bit of time. And the reason he looked interesting was he was connected to that nature center, of course, but also he lived on the same street that Amanda Berry was from, and where Amanda Berry grew up. And if you don't remember Amanda Berry, she's one of those 3 women that came out of Ariel Castro's house in Cleveland after being abducted for 10 years. Now, at the time, she was still missing. So all I knew was this top suspect in Amy's case was living on the same street as this other girl who went missing. I'm like, he has to be the guy, right? So I go to his house to meet him and interrogate him one night as a reporter. And I knock on his door, and he opens it up, and immediately 3 cats show up around his ankles. And there are these like Maine Coon cats, like long-haired, giant cats. And I'm fiercely allergic to cats. Like, as soon as I see cats, my eyes start watering, and I start sneezing. And so I'm trying to interrogate him. I'm like, where were you on the date that, sneezing. And then I noticed, like, one of his cats is sick. And it's got this, like, goop coming out of its eye. And so I'm like repulsed, and he's mad because I can't get anything out without sneezing. And finally he's like, dude, get away. You know, get out of my house. I have nothing to say to you. And he shuts the door. And I think, oh my God, I've tipped this guy off. Now he knows I'm onto him. He's going to get rid of any evidence he has in the Amy Mihaljevic case. I've screwed the case. I'm like, well, he's going to throw stuff away. He's going to throw away this evidence. I better come back and pick through his garbage. So I go home. I call up Waste Management. I'm like, hey, I just moved to this street. When do I put my garbage out? And they're like, oh, you put it out Thursday night. We'll be by Friday morning to pick it up. I'm like, great. So Thursday night rolls around. I go to Target in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. And I spend $20 on completely black gear, black pants and shirts, just like you see in the movies. So I can't be seen. And I drive up in my Sunfire, and I park a half mile away just to be sure. And I sneak over to his house, and it worked. Because I get to his house, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and his trash is out on the lawn to be picked up. And I grab the first bag I come to, and I pick it up. And it's heavy, like criminally heavy. Like there must be a torso in this bag. And I'm like, son of a bitch, I got him. This is it. And I run back to my Sunfire, I toss it into the back seat. I get in the car, I drive to a 24-hour convenience store where all the lights are on and I can see what's going on. And I jump out, I get to the back seat, and I rip open the bag like a bag of peanuts and cat litter and cat turds go everywhere. And the smell hits me, and I start gagging, and then I come to the realization that not all those turds are solid anymore because the cat was sick, and it's like in everything. So I go to a 24-hour car wash. And I'm that creep at 3 o'clock in the morning that's fiercely vacuuming out the back seat like he's murdered somebody. I'm sure I made it on some sort of list. And the smell was so bad, I did as best as I could, but I had to sell that car a couple weeks later. And it was in really good shape. And I know to this day, somebody's driving around in Cleveland in that Sunfire, and in the summers when it gets muggy and hot, and the smells come out, they gotta be thinking like, what the fuck happened in this car? What is that smell? They wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't believe it. Doing things like this, picking through people's garbage, going to Key West to investigate a serial killer, eventually it puts you in a dark place. And luckily, a lot of my friends are stand-up comedians. They're into comedy. And so when I'd find myself in these situations, I'd get depressed and I would call them and I'd say, tell me a joke, get me, make me laugh, get me in a better mood. And I remember one night, I'm in Mingo Junction, Ohio, which is the steel town outside of I don't even know where, near the border of West Virginia, and I'm staking out this guy's house because I'm convinced that he killed 3 girls in the early 80s in Akron. I'm waiting for him to come home. He works at Time Warner Cable. And I'm just in a dark place. And I called up my friend, Mike Polk, and I'm like, Mike, I'm in a real bad place. I'm like, can you tell me a joke? Just make me laugh. Get me in a better mood. He's like, okay, Jimmy. He's like, I got a joke for you. He said, a child molester and a young girl go walking through the forest. And the young girl looks up at him and says, gee, mister, it's really dark in this forest, and I'm very scared. And he looks down at her and says, you're scared? I gotta walk back alone. So it's not my joke, but it didn't help. It was around this time that I have what I lovingly refer to as my first nervous breakdown. And if you've never had one, I highly recommend it. You come out very in a better place on the other side. Now, there were a couple signs that this was going to happen, and one of them was I had to stop going to the grocery store, because this is what would happen. I would go to the grocery store, and I would find myself in line behind a single man, and I would notice he didn't have a wedding ring. And I would look through his cart, and in his cart would be like 12 Stouffer's mac and cheese frozen dinners. And I would think to myself, that's way too many frozen mac and cheese dinners for one single man. I bet he's got a woman chained up in his basement. And I would get his license plate just in case. That's where my mind was going. One day my wife, Julie, she came home from school, and she comes around the corner, and I've taken out every single piece of furniture from our living room. The couches, the lamps, the tables, everything. I'm down on my hands and knees, I'm combing the carpet. And she says, what the fuck are you doing? And I'm like, there's something in this room that's making me sick. I don't know what it is, but I must be allergic to something. I haven't felt right for weeks. And she kind of laughed. She's like, it's not, you're not sick. It's in your head. And I realized she was right. And that day I went to the Yellow Pages and I opened up, and I didn't know where to look for a psychologist, but they're in the Yellow Pages, they were. And I just sorted through, and I found one with a funny name, and I'm like, let's try her. She's in the Valley, which is where all the psychologists hang out. And I go to her office, and we have this initial meeting, and she says, well, for me to really understand what's going on with you, the best thing we can do is have you take this test. It'll tell me where your mind's at. Now, this test is called the MMPI, which stands for the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory. It's a very old test. They designed it in the 50s and 60s, but it's actually still what we give to CIA recruits to weed out the crazies to this day. It's a 500 question test. It's like a ream of paper, and you have to fill out these bubbles like strongly agree or like disagree type of thing. And the questions, I remember a few of them. One of them was, do you enjoy reading true crime magazines? Another one was, do you enjoy a glass of wine with dinner. And there was another question, and it went like this. It said, do you enjoy playing pass the napkin? And I'm like, pass the napkin? Is that a sexual thing? Because yes. But if you don't, like, eventually I learned what pass the napkin is. It's this old game that they used to play in like the 30s and 40s. It's kind of like Duck, Duck, Goose. So I got that wrong. But I turned in the questions, and I came back a week later for the results. I remember walking into her office, and I'm like, hey, so how'd I do? And she's just behind her desk, and she's going like this. I'm like, what? And she said, well, interesting thing. Your results are exactly the way that Ted Bundy, the exact same results that Ted Bundy got when he took the test. And that's one of those things that you can't unhear, no matter how much you want to. And she said, she's like, it suggests that you're a sociopath. And I'm like, that sounds really bad. And she said, well, don't worry about it. She said, a lot of detectives, a lot of private eyes are also, sociopathic. A lot of successful businessmen and CEOs are sociopaths. She's like, look at everything Trump's done. That did not go over well in Birmingham, Alabama, by the way. So I go home, and I'm thinking to myself after this meeting, like I gotta explain this to Julie, and were there signs? I'm going back through my whole life. Were there signs that suggested I might be a sociopath? And I remember two things. I remember the story that my dad likes to tell about the time when I was 3 years old and the family cat died. Don't worry, I didn't kill the cat. I did not kill the cat. But we lived out in the country, and the cat ran out into the road and got hit by a car. My dad knew how close I was to Sir Jonathan Longwhiskers. And so what he did was he brought the cat in, and he planned out this whole Catholic mass, this ritual that we could do so I'd feel better. And he dug a big hole, and we put the cat in it, and we tossed dirt, and we said good things about Sir Jonathan Longwhiskers. He was really good at catching mice. And my dad said this. And then he turned to me at the end, and he said, do you have anything you'd like to say? And I said, yeah, Dad, I'd say it's time for a new cat. It didn't faze me. And then I thought of one other thing that happened, which is when my wife, she's a teacher, like I said, and I don't know if there are any teachers in the audience or if you know teachers, but one thing you should know is before school starts every year, the teachers have to go to school for a couple days before the kids show up, just to start planning. And that's when the administration sometimes brings in guest speakers to get everybody fired up for the new school year. And this is what my wife's school does. And every year they bring in these guest speakers. And one year they brought in this guy who told them a bunch of logic puzzles they could give to their students to find out about their personalities. And one of these logic puzzles was to figure out if you had a sociopath as a student, which is weird, right? But here's how the logic puzzle went. She came home and she told this to me, and she said, okay, picture this young man, and tragically his mother dies one day. And at the funeral and at the wake, this young man meets this young woman, and they hit it off right away. They're like star-crossed lovers. They're meant to be together. They start finishing each other's sentences, and they fall deeply in love in just that half day. And at the end of the wake, the girl writes down her name and phone number on a piece of paper. This is before Facebook and Twitter and all that. She writes down her name and phone number, and he puts it in his pocket, tucks it into his pocket, and they say goodbye. Now that night, his dad, wanting to do something nice for his son, washes all of his son's clothes, and that piece of paper disintegrates. So the question is, how does this young man find this girl that he's destined to be with? To which I say, he kills his dad. Because surely, if she came to his mother's funeral, she'll come to his father's funeral too. Julie her eyes got big. She's like, it didn't take you a second. It was like you were planning that the whole time. So I think, yeah, maybe there's some signs there. I go back to the therapist a week later and I say, now that we know how I tested on this, now what do you recommend? What do I do with my life? And she says, well, she's like, you gotta lean into it. She's like, why don't you write a new true crime book? I said, no offense, Doc, that sounds like a terrible idea. She's like, no, make it work for you. She's like, find a new crime to write about. And so I went back and I started looking for that perfect crime. I remember sitting there watching an episode of 2020, and it was a special on 2 disappearances. One was Brooke Wilberger, a tragic case, but pretty typical abduction. The other case was Maura Murray. And the more I heard about the Maura Murray case, the more my ears perked up. And if you're unfamiliar with Maura's case, I'll try and sum it up for you. In February 2004, this is the week that Facebook launched, by the way, Maura was a student, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And on a Monday afternoon, she emailed her professors and said, there's been a death in the family, hold my homework till the end of the week. That was a lie, by the way, no death in the family. She then goes to the ATM, empties out her bank account, about $280, goes to the liquor store, buys way too much booze for one person, gets into her Saturn, drives north into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. About 7:30 that night, it's February, remember, so it's dark, she's driving along the Kangamangas Highway, and she comes to this like 90-degree turn at a weathered barn, loses control of the vehicle, crashes into a snowbank. Now there are 3 houses nearby, and they hear the crash happen, people that are living there, and it's not that unusual. And so they call the police. And the time that the accident occurred to when the first officer arrives on scene is somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes. And somewhere in that window, Maura vanishes, never to be seen again. So I realize this is a good case because it's not just one mystery, it's actually 2. What happened to Maura Murray? But also, what was she doing in the White Mountains to begin with? I like the odds because if I could figure out the answer to one of those questions, maybe the other would present itself. So I started digging into it. First thing I did was call up her father through a family spokesperson, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about writing a book about your daughter's case. And he got back right away and said, no, I don't want a book written about this. I don't want any coverage on this. And that was the first red flag. And at the time, in this 2020 special, they made Maura out to look like the perfect girl, the perfect all-American girl, perfect to a fault. I knew that couldn't be true because we all have skeletons in our closet. And so I started peeling back the layers, did a lot of public records requests, and I found some interesting things out. One, at the time, she ended up at the University of Massachusetts Amherst because originally she was at West Point, a very prestigious military academy, and she was about to be kicked out of West Point for stealing from Fort Knox. She stole from the most secure facility in the United States. And we're not talking gold bullion. She stole like $4 worth of makeup from the commissary and got caught. It's a cry for help. So they allowed her to withdraw before they kicked her out. She ended up at UMass. And then at UMass, she got in trouble for credit card fraud and identity theft. She started stealing people's credit cards numbers and using them to order food. She got caught in some weird sting. And they told her, if you can stay out of trouble for 3 months, we'll make this go away. It'll be like it never happened. But then 2 days before her disappearance, her father comes to the university. And along the way, he stops at 8 different ATMs and takes out $4,000 in cash, as you do. And he says it's for, it's to buy a used car, but they never do end up buying a used car for her that weekend. Who knows what the cash is about, but she borrows his car to go to a party on Saturday night. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, she turns to her friends and says, I gotta talk to my dad. It's important. And they're like, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, go to sleep. She's like, no. She gets in a car, starts driving to her father's motel room, gets into an accident, crashes into a guardrail. She's gonna be cited for failure to control at least, maybe a DUI. And I think she realized at that point that credit card stuff was going to come back to get her because she couldn't stay out of trouble. And so she had reason to leave. So all this was going on. I had started a blog on the Maura Murray case, and Julie came to me and she's like, aren't you afraid that people are going to come after you? And I'm like, no, that's, I had this editor, he said, nobody comes after the reporter. If they're going to kill somebody, they'll kill your source, so you're fine. So I thought we were fine. And then on the 8th anniversary of Maura's abduction, I pulled up YouTube, and there's this clip, and it's got Maura's name on it. I pull it, I click it, and it's this creepy old man's face, and he's looking at the camera, and he's in this murder basement, like concrete walls, and he's just looking, and he's laughing, he's going, ha 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 ha, and this goes on for a minute and a half, and then he stops, he winks at the camera, and then it fades to happy anniversary, Maura Murray. And I'm thinking, and everybody that I'm talking to online is thinking, oh my God, this is Maura's killer. He's taunting us on the anniversary of her abduction. We got to find this guy. I had this popular blog going on the case. And so the next day, I post this video, and as a challenge to the armchair sleuths that are helping me on the case, I say, let's find him. Let's identify him. And within 24 hours, we do. We figure out who this guy is. And he's a guy named Alden, and he works as a Walmart greeter in Hadley, Massachusetts, which is right next door to where Maura was going to school. And so I put his name out there, fuck it, here's the guy. He didn't like that. The next day, he puts up another YouTube video. I click on it, and it opens up, and it's pictures of my kid. I have, at the time, a 5-year-old son named Casey. And it's pictures of Casey. And my first thought was, oh my God, he took these pictures from outside of our house. And then I realized, no, these are pictures that I took. They're from my personal Facebook profile. And he's stolen them, and he put them to creepy music, and it's this threat. So, very awkward conversation with Julie. It's her worst fears. The next day I call up the prosecutors in Massachusetts, and I'm like, I'm on this conference call. It's the prosecutor, it's the sheriff. And we're talking about what to do. And I'm like, so, did you arrest him yet? And they're like, well, no, we can't. It's First Amendment. There's nothing we can do. And I'm like, what if he shows up at my house with a shotgun? What then? They're like, well, call us back because that's a pretty good case. So, I want to tell you a little bit real quick about Casey, who was in that video. Because at this time, Casey started acting very strangely. He had just started kindergarten, and he started having these violent outbursts where he would just have these complete meltdowns, and he would throw his chair at the teacher, toss desks over, he'd run out of the classroom. So I'm investigating these serial killers, these men with violent tendencies, and my 5-year-old son starts to show these same characteristics. And my first thought was, shit, I've got this Ted Bundy gene that I've passed on to my kid, right? And the teachers, they come to me and they're like, you got to get your kid tested. You got to find out what's going on. And so we do. And Julie and I take him to all these tests. We did dozens of tests. We end up at Case Western Reserve University, and they're having this psychological test for all ages, and they need a kindergartner, and they bring him in. And it's like you see on TV where you're behind that pane of glass where you can see through, but they can't see in. And Julie and I are on one side, and on the other side is Casey, and he's interacting with a proctor. He's doing puzzles and games, and we're seeing how he interacts with people. And the psychologist comes in afterwards, and that's the first time that we hear the word autism. She said, your son is on the spectrum. There's no doubt about it. He probably has what we used to call Asperger's. And I turned to her and I say, Asperger's? She's like, yeah, we don't call it that anymore, but it used to be called Asperger's. And so I went home and I told my friends, I'm like, they're saying my kid has Asperger's. And I remember Bill, one of my friends, he says, Asperger's? He's like, that's the worst name for a condition ever. He's like, you might as well call it butt sandwich. And so after that, we did. And so I'd get these calls from the teacher, you know, your kid's having a meltdown again. And I'd respond without thinking. I'm like, well, you've read his IEP. You know about the butt sandwich. And she's like, excuse me? I'm like, Asperger's. Now, the one good thing, I won't say the one good thing. There are many good things about having a kid on the spectrum. But it also allows you to tell jokes about autism. I don't know if you know this, but if you have a kid, it gives you a free pass to tell autism jokes. But you know who hates autism jokes? Doctors. Doctors hate them. And at this time, we had another kid, a little girl named Elaine. And so it was my job during the day to take her to all her pediatrician visits and get her vaccines. And I remember taking her to get her measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And by this time in Ohio, there are so many anti-vaxxers that the doctors have to give this spiel before they give your kid the medicine. And it's, yes, this vaccine contains mercury. No, it's not the bad kind of mercury. It won't give your kid autism. To which I said, with all due respect, doctor, that's what you told us the last time. And he was pissed. And he called Julie right away and told on me, by the way. I like these little middle school cafeteria cups we have here. So to recap, there's a lot of stress in my life at this point. My kid's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, whatever they called it at the time. I am getting threatened by these people in the Maura Murray case. I've also found out maybe I'm a sociopath. So I figured the best thing that I can do is self-medicate. And so I had this routine that I came up with where I would be an excellent husband and father during the day. I would get my kids to school, and then I would put them to bed at the end of the day. And then, once they were safely asleep, I would go and I'd pour myself a big gulp cup and half full of vodka and then Kool-Aid, because I'm classy like that. And then I would go upstairs to my office and I would smoke a bowl of marijuana, which is still illegal in Ohio. And then I would come downstairs to the medicine cabinet and I would get my wife's oxycodone. They gave Julie a ton of oxycodone for our second kid, for childbirth, but she didn't take any of them because she doesn't believe in narcotics. Turns out I am a big believer in narcotics. And so I would do this medley. And then I would go downstairs to the couch and I would stream Doctor Who until I passed out. And then I'd wake up the next morning and I'd do it all over again. And this went on for a while. Until one morning I wake up, I'm hungover, I get a call from my mother. And she says this, she says, there's a man stalking your sister. Now I have 4 sisters. I'm blessed and cursed. And she's talking about Barb, who is 21, 22 years old at the time. She's a beautiful young woman. She lives in Lakewood, which is where you end up immediately after college. No matter where you're from in Ohio, you end up in Lakewood for a little bit. And she has this large dog that's like a pit bull, mastiff, monster thing. And she walks it through the neighborhood. And there's all these older women walking their chihuahuas and Yorkies. And this thing looks at those little dogs and thinks snack and tries to eat them. And then the old women call the animal protective office on her. And so she starts getting these fines. And there's this young animal warden who falls in love with my sister. And he starts showing up at her house after hours, not in uniform. And he talks his way into her apartment every time. And he just kind of walks around and he's like, I'm just checking up on your dog. You really should get rid of it. And he's looking around. And to me, the first thing I think of is BTK, right? Dennis Rader, this serial killer from Wichita, and that's what he would do. He was an animal warden, and he would case people's houses this way, and then they'd get rid of their dog, and he'd come back and murder them. So I hear this. First thing I say is, don't get rid of the dog. She has to go to court the next morning. This animal control officer is going to be there. And I say, I'll be there. So I'm fiercely hungover, and I show up at court, and my sister's called in front of the judge, and this judge his name's Judge Carroll. And it's one of these small little fiefdoms where they've had the same judge for like 30 years, and he kind of runs the town, and he has this court, and everybody has to go in front of him, and she's called up, and I go up, I stand up with her, and he looks at me and says, "Hey, are you her lawyer?" And I say, "No, Judge Carroll, I'm her older brother, but there's something about this case you should know." And he's like, "Well, if you're not her lawyer, I don't want you talking." And I say, "Judge Carroll, I'm a crime writer, I don't know if you know. So I know how courts work, I get it, but there's really something you should know about this animal warden over here." And he says, "Look, you need to shut up and get out of my courtroom." And now I'm fired up because I'm trying to protect my sister. So as I'm walking out, I'm like, "This guy's stalking my sister, he's a creep." And Judge Carroll says, "If you say one more thing, I'm gonna find you in contempt." And then the little asshole pops out of my brain. And we all keep this Rolodex, right? And if you're a journalist in a small town for any number of years, you learn everybody's deepest, darkest secrets, and you keep tabs. And so the little asshole flips through the Rolodex, and it's like, "What do we know about Judge Carroll?" "Oh yes, he's big into AA." "Okay, we can make that work." And he says, "If you say one more thing, I'm gonna find you in contempt." To which I say, "Judge, you're nothing but a drunk." And there was this gasp, this audible gasp. There was this old woman stenographer who's typing away, and she hears what I said, and she grabs her chest like she's having a heart attack. And I turn my back on the whole lot, and I go sauntering out of the courtroom. And I get one step into the hall, and I feel somebody pick me up and throw me across the hall into the concrete wall. And I think it's this animal control officer who's obsessed with my sister. So when I feel his hands trying to pull my arms behind my back, I grab him. I don't know where the strength came from. And I flip him over my shoulders, and he lands on his back. And I realize, oh, that's not the animal control officer at all. That's a police officer with a gun. And there's one witness to this whole altercation. This woman who came to pay her parking ticket and wanted nothing to do with this. And she's looking at me like I'm about to be murdered. And the police officer stands up and he grabs his taser because I'm white. And and I throw up my hands and I say, "Don't tase me, bro." And he arrests me on the spot, and as he's handcuffing me, I turn to the witness, and I'm like, "I'm really sorry about this, but I'm gonna need your name and number." And she's just shaking her head like this. And he takes me into the jail, and it's not the jail's in the same building, so it's very convenient for him. And he books me. I'm charged with contempt of court. I get 10 days on contempt of court, which is obscene. But I'm also charged with assault on a police officer, which is a felony that carries 8 years in prison. So I'm right back where I started. And I remember being in the cruiser as they're transporting me to the next jail, and the police officer who's driving the car looks back, he's like, "You're lucky. They're taking you to Brecksville." I'm like, "What's Brecksville?" He's like, "That's like the Hilton of jails." And I don't know if you've ever been to a Hilton before. I've been lucky enough, I've been in a couple for like a wedding or something. It's not at all like the Hilton. It's a little like an Econo Lodge. But they put me in this pod, which is this common area that has a TV and a shower and a table. And then they've got 4 cells that open up into this pod. And I've got my own cell that I can hang out in. I'm there with 2 other young men, one for stealing a car, the other pulled a knife on a guy in a bar fight. We're all hanging out. One guy, his mother brings in board games, because you're allowed to do that. And the mom brings in a brand new version of Monopoly, which is the worst game to play in general, but certainly in a jail. But we play this because there's nothing else to do. And I'm not making this up. This poor guy went to jail 3 turns in a row, directly to jail. And I'm sitting there thinking, I have to explain the abstract concept of irony here, because this is the perfect opportunity. And And that's kind of the way it went. We watched cops on TV. I don't know if they were looking for people they knew. But day 2, I wake up and I can't steady my hand. And it's shaking. And I realize, that's the first time I realized I had a problem. And it's probably not the oxycodone, it was probably the booze more than anything else. And I was going through withdrawal, and it was a rough 24 hours after that. The next day I woke up, I still felt like I had the flu, but I felt a little better. And I went to the guard and I said, hey, do you have anything I can read? Because I'm going crazy in here. And she says, yeah, follow me. So we went out into the hallway. She took me to a broom closet. Inside the broom closet was a cardboard box. Inside that box were paperback books. And I know what you're thinking, Brecksville Jail, like what do they have in the book selection in this cardboard box? Must be nothing but James Patterson or something. But here's the weird thing. Inside that box was every book I'd always wanted to read and never had the chance to read. For instance, there was the first novel by Dan Brown, and I know he's not a great author, but I'd always wanted to read that, Deception Point, I think it's called. But also, the weirdest part, inside that box was Michael Crichton's autobiography. It was called Travels. It was out of print. I'd been trying to find it for years, and here it is sitting in this cardboard box in Brecksville Jail. And if you've never read Travels, Michael Crichton's the author of Jurassic Park and all this. This is his autobiography. There's a chapter in Travels where he trips out on LSD and has a conversation with a cactus. It's amazing. So I've got these books and I'm crying because I just can't believe what's going on. And the guard, she picks up a copy of the Bible and she puts it on top of all these books. And she says, do me a favor. When you get back to your cell, read John 14:14. I'm like, okay, deal. So I go back to my cell and I actually do. I pick up the Bible, I read John 14:14, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially what it says is, ask anything in my name and you'll receive it. To which I immediately said, Jesus, get me the fuck out of jail. Shift change. 10 minutes later, another guard comes up, he's checking through everybody's common areas, and he says, Renner, Judge Carroll just called, you're out in the morning. So I got out, but out of the frying pan into the fire type of thing, because I was still facing 8 years in prison on attempted assault on this officer. And it all comes down to that witness. So we went to the prosecutor and we said, hey, there's a woman that saw everything. I was heading out, I was walking, I was leaving, and this guy jumps me. And, so let's interview her. And the prosecutor's like, oh, we wouldn't know where to begin. Who knows who that woman was? I'm like, well, there were cameras, so let's just get the film on the cameras in that hallway. And the prosecutor's like, funniest thing, they weren't taping that day. We don't have any footage. So I'm like, what do I do? So I went back, I went through the docket of that court, over 250 names, everybody that came in that day to pay speeding tickets, parking fines, whatever. Went through that whole list of names, and then I cross-referenced it on Facebook, and I found that woman. And we sent a private investigator out to her house. She signed an affidavit, said yes, he was on his way out, this cop jumped him from behind, and we were able to get the charge dismissed because of that. But I'd be sitting in prison if I didn't find that woman on Facebook. I'm getting towards the end here, but I do want to say at about this point when I realized I had a problem and I stopped drinking, I started doing better. And I don't know if it was, Casey seeing that I was doing better, he started doing better. It was because we knew he was on the spectrum, we knew how to deal with him, whatever. We both started doing better. And I started getting out again, meeting people, and I would go to I went to a lot of book fairs that year. And I remember there was a book fair in Bedford, which is on the west side, and I had my table of books and my dum-dum suckers. And this older man comes up to my table, and he sees Amy's book with her picture on the front, and he picks it up and he's looking at it. And he tells me he's a retired park ranger. And I say, park ranger? I got a story for you. And I told him about that day in the park where I was almost abducted. And his face just loses all color. And he says, have you ever looked into my old boss? And I said, look into your old boss for what? And he does this, for all of this. So as soon as he's gone, I Google his boss, is a guy named Vern, who used to run the Metro Parks in and around Cleveland. The first thing that comes up are all these newspaper articles about how this guy Vern was arrested in the Metro Parks for soliciting a blowjob from an undercover agent while there were kids playing around. And it was the same park where I was almost abducted, the exact same park. And the newspaper articles had his picture, and damned if he didn't look exactly like Leonard Nimoy. So I figure I have to talk to this guy. I find out he's living in Lakeside, which is a gated community on Lake Erie. I drive out to him one day and I question him. He denies ever having tried to abduct me. And I say, well, regardless of what happened there, I said, I find it very interesting. Some of the things I found in your personnel file, which is public record in Ohio if you're running the Metro Parks. 10 days after Amy Mihaljevic was abducted in 1989, you checked yourself into a mental hospital. I said, what was that all about? And he was honest. He said, he told me he had sexual urges he could not control, and he checked himself in before he could hurt anybody else. And I said, that's very odd that just 10 days after Amy was taken, that's when you had that incident. But how do you square that when he's such a good suspect? But so is this guy in Key West, Florida. In March of this year, just this year, we found out what Bay Village has in the way of DNA in Amy Mihaljevic's case. And it's not like in CSI or any of that. It's never that good. What they have for DNA are 3 hairs that they found on Amy's body. And they had them tested. And if you think of DNA as a ladder with 500 rungs, all they were able to get out of those hairs was about 4 or 5 rungs. So not enough to convict anybody with a match, but enough to start ruling people out. Because if you don't have those rungs in that order, it can't be you. It's also enough for them to realize that each of those hairs came from a different white male, which there's only a couple explanations for. One, it could be trace evidence. So whoever took Amy in their car, perhaps they gave a ride to a friend a week earlier, and that friend was in the passenger seat, and one of his hairs came out and stuck to the chair, to the seat, and when Amy was there, it went from the seat to her body. That's trace evidence. Another explanation is there were more than one man involved in the crime. Maybe that's why we've never been able to solve it. Maybe they alibi each other out for part of the crime. Interesting thing about Vern and Dean is they knew each other from the Nature Center. Dean brought his mice there. Vern, if you walk into the Nature Center to this day, the first thing you see is a wall of benefactors. And Vern's name is front and center. Nature Center Menelato. I want to leave you with one little bit of good news. I recently got a new therapist. My old one retired, I think, or she just ran away. The new one is younger, and that's a strange moment in your life where you start taking life advice from somebody who's younger than you. What you also have to do with a new therapist is kind of bring them up to speed. You have to go through all that junk that you have already gone through and let them know where you're at. And so the first thing I did was I told her about this test, the MMPI, and how I took it and how it told me I was a sociopath. And she laughed. And I said, that's not funny. And she said, well, she's like, it's a very old test, and those are old diagnoses. There's a new diagnosis that covers how you did on that test. There's another explanation for it, and she said, it's kind of staring you in the face, and I can't believe you haven't figured it out on your own. And I said, what's that? She's like, well, it explains, how you have this lack of empathy, and how, death doesn't really bother you, and how you become fixated on these cases. She's like, you're on the spectrum. She's like, you have Asperger's. And I said, Doc, are you telling me I have butt sandwich? She's like, butt sandwich? What the hell? She's like, Asperger. I'm my Asperger's. Okay. She's like, we can hope. We can hope. Thank you very much, Portland, for coming out to my show tonight. I am James Renner. If you like my stories, you can find more on jamesrenner.com. I've got books, and I've got a podcast called The Philosophy of Crime. I'll be sticking around. If you have any questions or anything, I'll be mulling around for a little bit. But thank you very much for having me into your city and for coming out tonight so late on a Friday night.